Bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of Science Policy series of Canadian Science Policy Centre. This session is titled Canadian Strategies for Responsible Nanotechnology Innovation. It's a fascinating discussion. The panel is organized by Health Canada. You're here for a real treat. But before anything, I just want to do the land acknowledgement. I am talking to you today from Ottawa, the traditional land and unceded territory of Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. This session is quite exciting and talks about a very important aspect of biomedical research and its applications. As I mentioned, the panel is organized by Health Canada, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session. Dr. Ellis is a professor of neurology and distinguished scholar in neuroethics at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Ellis is a director of Neuroethics Canada. Among her many leadership positions in Canada, she is vice chair of the Canadian Institute of Health Research, CIHR Advisory Board of the Institute on Neuroscience, Mental Health and Addiction, and chair of the International Brain Initiative, director at large of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and a member of the board of directors of the Council of Canadian Academies. She's a world-renowned researcher, and it's an absolute pleasure to have her with us today. Dr. Ellis, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hariri, for that very nice introduction, and to everyone who has helped us to organize this panel. We're very grateful to the Canadian Science Policy Centre and, of course, to Health Canada for its tremendous interest and commitment to the topic of neurotechnology. So by way of introduction, advances in neurotechnology are really redefining the possibilities of improving neurologic and neuropsychiatric health and mental well-being. Alongside this progress, there's no question that related ethical, legal, and societal concerns such as the privacy of brain data, manipulation of personal information, autonomy and agency, and as well as non-medical and dual uses are increasingly pressing concerns. In this regard, neurotechnology presents challenges not only to Canada's federal and provincial healthcare systems, but to existing laws and regulations that govern responsible innovation in our country and around the world, and in the context of global neuroscience broadly. In December 2019, just before the pandemic, the OECD Council adopted a recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. The OECD Council is now urging that member states develop right-fit implementation strategies. Today in this session, we ask the question and step onto the journey of what should these strategies look like for Canada. Our panelists and our guests will propose and discuss opportunities that balance and leverage different professional and governance approaches towards the goal of achieving responsible innovation for the current state of the art, science, and engineering and policy in anticipation of the rapid and vast capabilities expected for neurotechnology in the future by and for this country. And this session is indeed the first step in our Canadian journey. So each of our panelists this morning and this afternoon, depending on where you are in our beautiful country, will have 10 minutes to set the stage in their area of expertise. There will be an interactive poll that precedes each brief presentation, and we urge you to participate. And then we equally look forward to a robust conversation with all of you who have joined us today. So let me make a few introductions. Dr. Graham Moffat is a neurotechnology entrepreneur and senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Graham, thank you so much for joining us today. Ian Burkhart, neurotech advocate and founder of BCI Pioneers Coalition. Ian, good morning and good afternoon. Professor Chandler is professor of law at the Center for Health, Law, Policy, and Ethics at the University of Ottawa. And our first speaker will be Andrew Atkinson, who is the manager of emerging science policy at Health Canada. And I want really again to reiterate my thanks to him and to Nathalie Labbé for bringing us together for this important meeting and virtual conference this morning. So, Andrew, I give the floor over to you to launch with Trudy at CSPC the first poll and to go into your presentation, please.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And yes, Judy, if you can launch the first question. This first question, hang on a second. So this poll question is now gauging current awareness of the recommendations and the 9 principles. So while we're responding to that, allow me to take a few moments to provide some background on the development and scope of these principles. As Dr. Ellis mentioned, following a multi-year consultative process in December 2019, OECD adopted and published the recommendation which embodies this set of 9 principles. I will say, though, it's an international initiative, but I will say Canadians with expertise in neuroscience, neuroethics, and neurotechnology background, including members of this panel, participated in this initiative. And thank you all for your participation in that and made substantial contributions towards the development of this recommendation. Also important to note, recognizing that Canada is an OECD signatory to this recommendation is not legally binding, but it does entail a moral and political commitment. And in Dr. Ellis's introduction, she mentioned my role at Health Canada, but also I have a role with the Canadian BNCT delegation. BNCT members truly represent the government of Canada as a whole. So it's not simply limited to Health Canada. And more broadly, we also represent Canada's national interests. Now, moving on to the 9 principles embedded in this recommendation, neurotechnology is expected to present challenges to Canadian healthcare systems and introduce important ethical questions. Consequently, a broad implementation plan for this recommendation is crucial to ensure we fully embrace the potential of this technology and minimize its risks. OECD is now, as Dr. Ellis mentioned, OECD is now encouraging member states to develop strategies to socialize and implement these regulations across government, industry, academic, and patient sectors. I'm going to stop here and take a little peek at the results of the poll, and we're saying, so in terms of the demographics watching this, so it looks like about around a quarter of people have actually heard of these principles in advance, and that's actually quite impressive. So that's very good to hear. Now, moving on to I'm going to put up a list of slides just to explain some details of the 9 principles. This is really to help us set the stage for today's discussion. I'll briefly introduce you to the principles. That said, I will invite you to explore further details on the OECD website to get a richer understanding of the scope of each principle. So, 9 principles are as follows. Principle 1, this is promoting responsible innovation. This stands as an overarching principle that speaks to broad issues such as promotion of beneficial applications for health and calls for the integration of ethical considerations in the development of neurotechnologies, as well as ensuring privacy, cognitive liberty, and autonomy of individuals. Principle 2, Prioritizing safety assessment is, of course, a principle close to Health Canada's mandate. It also encourages strong stakeholder engagement, as well as touching on cybersecurity. Principle 3, promoting inclusivity to foster a policy environment that ensures neurotechnology is both developed for and available to those in need, as well as the inclusion of underrepresented populations. We can go to the next slide. Principle 4 encourages fostering scientific collaboration across a range of stakeholders. And given the nature of neurotechnologies, we must engage many disciplines, such as computer scientists, cell biologists, clinician, patient communities, entrepreneurs, lawyers, ethicists. Principle 5 calls for societal deliberation as being a critical part of the recommendation, and calls for including a diversity of perspectives into decision-making processes, as well as policy and governance. Principle 6 addresses enabling capacity of oversight and advisory bodies, and to ensure these bodies possess the right multidisciplinary expertise for technology assessment and help address novel issues such as biases in artificial intelligence, which could support nanotechnology. And go to the next slide. Principle 7 addresses safeguarding personal brain data and other information, and includes ensuring that means of obtaining informed consent are adequate. Principle 8 promotes cultures of stewardship and trust across the public and private sector, such as the development of institutional company-level principles that promote accountability, integrity as part of the R&D process. And lastly, Principle 9 addresses anticipating and monitoring potential unintended use and or misuse of neurotechnologies. Also worth noting at this point, these principles were primarily established to focus on medical related technologies. However, with the increasing use of non-medical related neurotechnologies, for the purpose of our national conversation, our scope includes all neurotechnologies, understanding that they all have implications on the human brain. So I'm now going to stop here, but I'm going to pass over to Dr. Moffat. Before doing so, I'll introduce poll number 2, noting that this poll is actually specific to consumer technologies. The poll following this will actually ask about medical technologies. And the purpose of these next questions are really intended to acquire some information on the demographics of our audience, at least from the use perspective. So I will pass there and pass over to you, Dr. Moffat.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the panel today. This is an important and exciting topic that I think we all are very happy to see Health Canada working on, and to see some policy leadership from Ottawa on this developing topic. So I'm going to try to give a very brief, very broad scope overview of what's been happening in the neurotechnology industry, and a little bit of an outline of the kinds of technologies we're seeing, what's happening in the venture capital space, what's happening in the investment space, and what Canada's position is in this technology space. And I've done something a bit cheeky in that I am wearing, so many of you will be familiar with a Canadian neurotechnology called Muse. This is arguably the most successful consumer-oriented neurotechnology. But what you may not know is that this kind of technology actually can fit into ordinary, everyday items like glasses. So this is a set of EEG eyeglasses that was made in a partnership with Smith and Muse. And what we're seeing now is more and more of this type of integration of neurotechnology into standard wearable technology and the like. And this is, I think, accelerating, not fast, but it is accelerating. And this is attracting a significant amount of venture capital investment, a significant amount of technology company investment. It's very, very difficult to estimate how much of that investment is being attracted into the space, in part because it's not easily separable from things like neuropharmacology and medical devices. And so this distinction that Andrew mentioned between medical neurotechnologies and consumer and other neurotechnologies is not a clear one. And it's becoming increasingly blurry. So even when there are some clear distinctions between medical and augmentative or assistive or consumer-oriented neurotech, even where medical procedures are involved in implantation, the barrier is not necessarily clear because of the applications and because of the software layer. Now, I'll just show a quick slide to give you an idea of some of the types of.
Graham, before you as you bring your slides up, Trudy, do you want to launch the poll? There we go. Thank you. Graham, let's let this just stay up for a moment while you
By all means.
While you get your slides ready.
Yep. Not working, huh? Okay. All right. The bulk of activity in the space is now in medical and invasive neurotechnology, and we have seen a few startups in the EEG and wearable non-medical space succeed. There have not been a lot of successful neuromodulation technology companies that have gotten to scale outside of the medical space, or FNIR startups. These are the optical imaging ones that we're now seeing that have achieved significant market success. Canada has had an early lead in the neurotechnology space, thanks in large part to Canada's very successful reputation and record in academic neuroscience research. Most notable example of these is Muse, which is arguably the most successful neurotechnology company to date. But in general, Canada, unfortunately, has not seen the industry growth that we're now seeing in the USA and in Asia, despite our historic strength in academic neuroscience. So most of the growth now in the neurotechnology industrial sector is occurring outside of Canada. And this is arguably a risk to Canada, both economically, but also in turning back toward our academic research strengths. As the industry develops abroad and not here at home, we face this additional risk that whatever regulations or recommendations or guidelines we develop will have arguably a smaller influence if we don't succeed in nurturing homegrown innovation in neurotechnology here in Canada and in scaling it to market internationally. So with that, I think I'm getting close to my time. I will hand it back to the moderator and we can move along.
Dr. Moffat, thanks so much for those remarks. We're going to come back to, no doubt, some very interesting conversation around what you just presented. Trudy, I'm going to ask you to launch the third poll question. And then as you do that, I noted that about 15% of our audience, with 47 responders, were developers of some kind of technology, medical or non-medical technology. And the remainder, 85% of our audience, are interested parties who don't self-identify as developers of any sort. We have a third poll now. Mr. Burkhardt, let's go over to you. If you could read the poll question, please, and then launch into your presentation while people take a moment to respond. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you so much. The poll question reads, do you or someone close to you have direct experience with one or more medical neurotechnologies, for example, cochlear implants, deep brain stimulation? And this poll is a multiple choice, but you can pick all that apply to you. But I want to thank the organizers for having me speak on this panel. It's really fantastic to share my own experience as well as the experience of the others within the BCI Pioneers Coalition. I myself had a spinal cord injury about 13 years ago, which left me as a quadriplegic with minimal use of my arms and no function of my hands. With that, I was really looking for some sort of technology that would allow me to be more independent. And I was lucky enough to be close to a clinical trial site that they were using brain-computer interface to control muscle stimulation. So I had an implanted device in my motor cortex that can essentially read my thought intention of moving my arm, and then would translate that out to the computer, which would trigger stimulation of the surface of my skin to be able to use my arm again. So with that, I was able to restore function in my own arm to do things like play the Guitar Hero type video game, pick up a bottle and take a drink out of it, pour a bottle of things, swipe a credit card through a credit card reader, and do more dexterous movements with my hands, which was really promising, but it was still all in that research space and something that hasn't been transitioned yet from the clinic to the everyday world. So that's something that I think is really interesting as we look at the recommendations that the OECD has made. And the two that really speak to me are the second and third one, where we're talking about the safety assessment to make sure that these technologies are safe and that they can work. You certainly don't want to push something out ahead of its time before it is safe and is really applicable to the large, wider audience. But at that same time, you do want to have devices that really work well for the intended target audience. And that's where the project that I was working on, I think, was really successful, because we were able to have myself and others who would be the intended target of these types of devices work collaboratively with the research team to make sure that they're developed in the right way. There's a lot of things that at the Pioneers Coalition we talk about, where sometimes we're waiting on that perfect device, but there's also times where there's a lot of people in the disabled community that would be completely fine with something that's not perfect. It certainly still needs to be safe, but it doesn't have to be, the holy grail type device, as long as it can improve quality of life and independence for those with disabilities. It's something that people might put up with it being, maybe a little clunky, or that really first gen type device before they are able to really use it all the time, but maybe use it in certain activities and certain scenarios within their daily life that would allow them to be more independent. So for me, that's something where I was able to, with it, play some games, or be able to pick up objects. The constraints were still, I had to be tethered to the system. I didn't have full range of motion with my arm, but there's still certainly times where I would take those constraints and still use it. So I could be sitting at my desk being very productive with my work, and doing, different activities that I want to do. And then it would, take someone who would help me disconnect from the system, and I could go about my day to do other activities outside of being, connected to the system and using it fully. The other thing that I think is really important is promoting the inclusivity of how these devices are developed, and also how they can be used. We look at a lot of technology and it's fantastic, and it's relatively expensive to develop a lot of new technologies, and that leads right into a problem with access to technology. And if you look at the individuals who need these devices, especially, so I'm an American, and a lot of the individuals that need these types of devices are those that are on disability, may not have full resources to insurance coverage or other types of funding for these devices. And it can be really challenging to make sure that you're improving equitable access to these types of technologies while at the same time you're trying to push them to advance as quickly as possible. So that's kind of that balancing act that everyone, whether that's industry, policy, or even the users, needs to take into account for, to make sure that we're developing these devices in the best way that people are going to be able to use them, but also that we're going to be able to keep improving them so that they can get out to more and more people and improve their quality of lives. Another interesting point that the BCI Pioneers Coalition talks about a lot, and I kind of reached on it earlier, is like, what is the perfect outcome? Perfect is really a challenging space to be in, because it's never going to be perfect for everyone, but it needs to be able to be something that's good enough. And kind of settling for good enough, I think, is something that a lot of people with disabilities are okay with, because the opposite, and waiting on perfect, it may not be able to benefit them in their lifetime based on their condition and their priorities and needs. So it certainly is something where, fighting for it to be perfect and really be that best case device is challenging. But at that same time, you want to get something that is out there and accessible for the community to use. Now, that adds in another caveat as well, is if something is brought to the population and brought to market too early, it can be challenging in the fact that, well, if it's not adopted by the community, then that whole kind of sector will die on the vine. And so that can be really challenging as well. So I think it goes right back into the promoting the inclusivity of having these devices be developed with the end users in mind is something that's really important, so that they can help guide the direction of these devices, and making sure that you're not spending a whole lot of time on R&D on something that really doesn't translate into something that an end user is going to want to be able to do. But I look forward to our panel discussion further on to talk more and more about how these devices and any neurotechnology can improve the lives of individuals with disabilities like myself and others. But with that, I will pass it back to Dr. Illes, and we will go from there.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Burkhardt. Mr. Atkinson, if I just may take chair's privilege for a quick moment and just ask if Mr. Burkhardt could just give us a 1-minute précis about the BCI Pioneers Coalition. Who is it? When was it developed? How does one learn about it, and so forth? I think this is a really nice time to hear about that. While we're talking about inclusivity and building relationships and listening to our community deeply. So would you mind if we could do that?
Certainly, yeah.
Yes,
I guess I'm slacking on being able to plug my own organization a little bit. But the BCI Pioneers Coalition was founded just about a year and a half ago by myself and a few other individuals who have had the opportunity to participate in some clinical trials using implanted BCI technology. There's all types of external BCI technology, but then there's really just a few individuals that have been implanted with BCI technology in clinical trials, mostly in the States, but there also have been a few over in Europe. And I think there is hopefully going to be a few in Canada here shortly. And it was really a mission to further advocate on the possibility of these types of devices and the impact it can have on individuals with disabilities. So there's been roughly 32-ish people who have had this opportunity. And so that's something that's really unique. And we wanted to be able to have a platform to highlight and expand the experiences of those who have been able to use these types of technologies. So I myself used it to restore function to my own arm. But then there's been a lot of other people who have used it within their clinical trials to control a robotic arm, control mouse cursor, to help with speech, either by thinking of handwriting and it then being vocalized out through a synthesizer for speech, or thinking of the movement and the activity of speaking, but they have either ALS or some other neuro deficiency that doesn't allow them to speak. So it was really just a great resource and opportunity for us to share those experiences. We have a website, which is the bcipioneers.org. And we set up and we do webinars and also other advocacy to highlight the experiences of those other pioneers who have had this technology.
Thank you. I suspect there's going to be quite a few questions for you when we go into the Q&A session. And with that said, this is also a reminder, and you received this note in the chat line, to start putting your questions into the Q&A function. And don't hesitate. We're happy to start accumulating questions now, even as we go into the next speaker, who will be Professor Chandler. And over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to SPC and also to Health Canada for organizing this important discussion. And just segueing from what Ian had to say, that I'm working with Ian and with a team here in Ottawa on an implanted BCI trial, which is set to happen this summer. So things are happening in Canada too on that front. So just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what I'm doing here, I'm a professor of law, and I specialize in law and neuroscience, and with a particular interest in the development and use of neurotechnology and the various regulatory, legal and ethical issues that arise, and enjoy very much working with the participants in trials and with the scientists conducting trials, doing qualitative research with those groups. So my role on this panel is to highlight Principle 7, which is safeguarding personal brain data and other information. And later, we'll have a group discussion reflecting on the possible implementation strategies for the OECD neuromodulation technologies. And I have a few thoughts from the perspective of a lawyer about what the pros and cons of the various options might be. So if we could just put up my first slide, we will get going on having a bit of a discussion about safeguarding personal brain data. So this issue with respect to privacy of brain data is the 7th of the recommendations, and is motivated by a variety of concerns. One, that the brain data collected by neurotechnology could be interpreted and used in ways that secondary purposes that might not be intended or desired, and that might harm and disadvantage people. So that's one question, the secondary use of this brain data. The other concern is that values related to freedom of thought, self-determination, and privacy are at stake if this brain data can be accessed, interpreted, and then used to draw conclusions about people. So those two, one is the use of the data, and one is just the mere fact of its being accessible, interpreted, might cause consequences for people's perceived freedom of thought and self-determination. So I pause for a moment to say we're already collecting a ton of physiological data, Fitbits, Apple Watches, and behavioral data for that matter. Digital phenotyping is big, collecting social media behavior in order to make inferences about mental states and behavior. So one question to ask is, what's different about brain data? And I think there are reasons to think that it is different. It depends upon the interpretations that are made and in what contexts. And so I think if we look at the commentary on all of this, there's a definite sense that brain data allows us to draw a range of conclusions about people that goes beyond perhaps what we might infer from their behavior on social media. So let's talk about brain data. And I want to talk about two technologies to basically explore the evolutionary trajectory and what it might mean for brain data. And so I'll point to deep brain stimulation, which is widely used for Parkinson's disease. It's used for OCD and other things. It involves an electrode into the brain to deliver electrical stimulation for neuromodulation purposes. And what we're seeing in the evolution of this technology is a move to closed loop, which essentially means one electrode stimulates the brain while another is gathering data about the brain state in order to determine when to stimulate. And this is interesting. You can see it of course, involves the collection and monitoring of brain states. And so here we have data moving in the direction of collecting brain data within this device. The other evolution is, by the way, sorry, just to stop, I put up a little grab of NeuroPace, which already licenses and provides epilepsy, closed loop epilepsy, deep brain stimulation. And Medtronic has recently had approved its BrainSense technology, which is used for experimental purposes at the moment, not for clinical, but it's going in that direction. So the other big change is the adoption of telemedicine. So the use of online virtual care techniques to adjust deep brain stimulation in patients who have it implemented. So Abbott has its Neurosphere virtual clinic license for this. And this really hit the big time during COVID when a lot of attention was paid to facilitating virtual care. So these are two things that aren't coming together yet, but if one thinks about closed loop and the collection of brain data together with moving into virtual care models, we're going to have brain data streaming around over the internet. And so very convenient, improves care. We can do better quality improvement of devices by collecting all of this information and sending it to various people, but it raises clear risks about the integrity, the protection, the confidentiality of this information. And what kinds of risks, you might ask? Well, let me give you an example, which admittedly, these are rare examples, but it illustrates the kind of secondary use that might come up. There was a case in Ohio in the last couple of years of a man with implanted pacemaker whose data was subpoenaed to basically prove that he was unlikely to be telling about the truth about his actions at the time his house burned down. This was a criminal prosecution for arson. In another case, and the court received and was willing to accept this data. And in another case, a man with implanted DBS for epilepsy assaulted someone and actually went back to get that brain data to show that, in fact, he'd been having a seizure at that time. So you can see both the offensive and the defensive use of this brain data. This is not what was intended by the developers nor the users. So we need to ask ourselves about secondary use. And secondly, if we turn to my other example of speech neurotechnology, this also is absolutely fascinating area, one that I've written about a little bit from the legal perspective. And there's remarkable steps being taken for people who have lost all motor ability to enable them to communicate. In some cases by detecting the motor representation of intended speech or handwriting. And then recently published in May 1, a couple of weeks ago, this Tang et al. Talking about using a different technology, not implanted devices, but functional magnetic resonance imaging. So an external, albeit not useful or practical in daily life, but an external technique to reconstruct meaning, the map of semantic meaning from brain activity. This is very interesting and again raises questions about what are the kinds of information that we will refine and be able to reliably detect from the brain, and what kinds of inferences do that support? I would note that all of these rely on artificial intelligence techniques, a kind of prediction to try to refine the decoding, and this raises all kinds of additional questions about intermediaries and the fidelity of the correctness of the interpretation. So with that, I come to recommendation 7, and my second slide, if you don't mind. We have recommendation 7 and what it suggests about safeguarding personal data. And we can see I've divided into 3 main themes here. There's the first set, which are aimed at controlling collection of data through user information and consent. From a legal perspective, this is all great. It seems to reflect autonomy, informed consent of people, but we know people can be induced to consent very easily, and especially if the technology is itself essential to them for some purpose, they will agree to give up a lot of privacy. So we have to think a little bit about what kind of approach is best to deploy here. And this moves us to the second one, which is more about controlling the permitted uses. So rather than try to constrain collection, you allow the collection, which is actually, it may be a very good idea. It could be used to improve the technologies, to do research, et cetera, but you control the uses. You aim not so much at the designer of the device, but the users of that data. And this can be a good approach. One analog to this is the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, where we collect the data, but we can't use it for certain purposes. And then the last kind of approach or theme in the recommendation is a focus on data security, which is catching these issues about integrity and authenticity and protection of the data itself. So I will close here. And I'd like to announce I've got 2 polls for you, which will come in succession. I think we'll probably move on to the next phase of our discussion here together while these are playing out. At this point, we've discussed a number of OECD recommendations. The first is they're both the same, but the first one asks you about non-medical applications. So think about 3 priorities for Canada amongst these OECD recommendations for non-medical applications. Afterward, we'll have the same question for you, but in relation to the medical applications. Are those priorities the same or not from your perspective? So I will turn it back to Dr. Illes to take us through the next steps.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Chandler. That was just so interesting. I have to say, I immediately have a question for you about how that cardiac pacemaker case played out in the context of arson, but we'll come back to that in the Q&A. We just want to make sure people are taking a moment to fill out the first poll. And Trudy, let's leave that up for another 5 or so seconds. And then, so both polls are here. So let's give people a moment to respond. And while we do that, I am going to ask Mr. Atkinson to pick up the gavel again and bring us into the next few slides. And then we will move into the discussion after that. Mr. Atkinson?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, looking forward to the results of these polls. But yes, jumping into the next segment, as I previously mentioned, and I think we've mentioned several times, OECD is now asking member states to simply go forth and implement this recommendation. What's particularly challenging about this recommendation is the breadth of potential stakeholders that fall within its scope. Case in point, BNCT has another recommendation which provides guidance related to the establishment, governance, use, et cetera, of human biobanks and genetic research databases. So, reaching implicated parties, like i.e. those responsible for housing biobanks and databases, and verifying implementation is certainly more straightforward. The neurotechnology recommendation and these 9 principles are all encompassing and implicate a broad range of players, including regulators, researchers and research institutions, funding bodies, potentially professional organizations, industry, healthcare providers, and patients. So, question facing us is, what is the model of implementation that is best fit for Canada? It may not be something that we can necessarily hash out on today's panel, but this panel is certainly start of a national conversation. And as a bit of a thought starter, we have a few implementation opportunities, concepts that can help kick off the discussion. So in terms of ideas, number 1, implementation could be as simple as pushing out the recommendation to a national list of neurotechnology. A second. list of neurotechnology stakeholders, perhaps with a survey component, perhaps with a biannual check-in. Secondly, another approach could involve linking the recommendation to neurotechnology funding opportunities. That presents challenges in terms of the willingness on the part of funding bodies to integrate these recommendations into their existing processes. But I guess the question is there a more facile approach, something that could involve socializing principles with funding recipients? Thirdly, we look at standard setting organizations such as the Standards Council of Canada. I mean, these organizations have played important roles, such as in implementing standards like ISO 9000, but is a standards approach to neurotechnology principles too burdensome in the Canadian context. But certainly there are, standards models that could be under consideration. Fourthly, another approach would be to foster education, training, certification coursework. Dr. Moffat mentioned Queen's. For example, Queen's is hosting a new neurotech micro-credential program. These are short courses available online for individuals already in the industry, and these were developed in consultation with industry. So certainly an opportunity to boost the knowledge of folks working in the field on these types of concepts. And 5, sticking with Queen's, they're also developing a neurotechnology risk assessment tool template, and that's based on the OECD principles. And this is used to evaluate ethical, legal, and social implications that neurotechnology products could have when used in society. So although the current audience is for students, they are interested in developing something useful for industry. And lastly, alternatively, we could establish a Made in Canada charter, which could welcome organizations to be charter signatories. And depending on the stakeholder, be it a researcher, research institution, industry, they could attest to adherence to some or part of the principles. France has kicked off such a charter, and they've had success in terms of having a number of organization companies stepping up to participate and have become signatories. So as you'll see, each of these 6 concepts, they're not necessarily a panacea, not necessarily a standalone model for how we can move forward. But I could imagine it could be a number of approaches or tools from this 6, and there could be more to consider as well, that may help to serve implementation in the Canadian context. So basically a right fit approach for Canada could possibly involve a combination of the above. But moving forward, I think the path of least resistance would, of course, involve engaging with stakeholders, particularly the stakeholders who are self-motivated, who share a common interest in seeing successful implementation of these principles in Canada. So, Dr. Illes, I will stop there. That lays a bit of the foundation for discussion, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we will, when we go into the Q&A, put that slide of possible implementation strategies, just to give us a basis to think forward about this journey. But let me just summarize the polls from Professor Chandler's presentation, and I have them up side by side. And I note for everyone that safety was the overwhelming concern for medical applications, and then there was really almost an even distribution among the other principles at 80%. But what's all very interesting is that safety was only rated by 53% as one of the top choices for non-medical applications of the neurotechnology. And I am happy to share my screen after if that's appropriate for us to look at these principles side by side. But I'm surprised that safety doesn't prevail in both contexts, and that's sort of an interesting item for us to note and for Health Canada also to take in consideration as we move forward. I wonder, Mr. Askin, do we want to launch the sixth poll question now about the most significant issues facing the Canadian neurotechnology sector? Is this a good time? I think we should do that. Maybe Trudy, if you could give us the sixth poll. Thank you. We'll give everyone a moment to answer the question. The question is, what is or are the most significant issues facing the Canadian neurotechnology sector? This will take us right into the discussion about where we go next together. And the audience is invited to pick all that apply. And for those who are joining us at one link, but as a group, you all have to sort out how to address these polls in hopefully a very democratic and congenial way. All right, while we wait for the poll to come up, I'm going to, perhaps we can actually have the demographic poll now. Just let's get that out of the way. There are 3 questions here. Trudy, if you could please bring up the demographic poll. We're very interested to know who you are joining us today, and that will also assist us in the conversation that we're going to go into. So let's look at that poll. It'll be brief. 3 questions. Thank you. Please answer all 3 questions, and if you are a group, do your best. We appreciate your participation in any form. And while we just give another few seconds for that, Dr. Moffat, do you feel you want to try to show your 2 slides again? Is that important, or are you happy to pass?
I will try to show 1 slide if I can. So let me see if I can do this here. Okay. Does this show up?
Very good.
There we go. Yeah.
Right.
So I just wanted to further what Mr. Atkinson said regarding the Neurotech Micro-Credentials program. So this is a new program developed in partnership with the Ontario government by Queen's University and Neurotech X. The initial course, Introduction to Neurotechnology, will be starting, I believe, according to Susan Banke, on June 30th, and that'll be followed by a number of courses in topics such as neuroimaging, neuromodulation, neuroethics. I think they have 9 courses planned so far, plus a capstone. So this will be a great opportunity for anyone in the sector, whether they're policymakers, just interested parties, or otherwise, to potentially get up to speed, learn very quickly about where the industry is and what the latest and greatest technologies and state of the art are. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity and a unique Canadian resource that will be very, very powerful and useful, not just here, but abroad as well.
All right. Thanks very much. I'm glad we were able to look at that slide. We have questions that are starting to come in. I'm just going to, whoops, I just lost the poll. Perhaps Mr. Atkinson, please co-moderate the Q&A with me. We have about 20 to 25 minutes. And I'll read the first question. If you can read the second one, and then we'll just go back and forth. That'd be great. The first one is from Tom Ladd. Well, Tom, it's nice to hear from you. His question is, please comment on the use of EEG data and its ownership collected non-invasively for various uses in clinical for-profit situations. I think this is a question that almost all of the panelists can address. Maybe I'll turn to Dr. Moffat to answer it first, and then we'll see who else among the panel would like to address it.
This is a great question, and it applies. And hi, Tom, by the way. This is a great question. It applies not only to EEG data, but really to any neuro data derived either clinically or non-clinically. I think in the case of, at least in the Canadian case, there are not many examples of clinical EEG data collected in for-profit settings. Most of these are in healthcare settings, at least clinically. But there are a number of examples of, for example, companies, neuromarketing firms, and the like, outside of the clinical and medical settings that are collecting EEG data at scale. And I include Muse in that, probably with the largest EEG database in the world of tens of millions of sessions of EEG. Now, of course, there are obvious laws. There are obviously data privacy laws, the most stringent of which being GDPR in Europe, which most companies will now be trying to adhere to, that grant ownership of the data to the users of the data who generate it, and then there are very distinct individual rights to privacy. The question then becomes, what should companies be allowed to do with those data? And I think that's a much more open question. There aren't good laws govern. There are plenty of laws covering individual user behavior data. Whether there's a special case or issue related to brain data is, I think, still open. And whether we need special laws for that is, I think, still open. This is very much what the OECD recommendations and this process are designed to determine and develop, hopefully.
Does anyone else wish to comment on the first question?
I was just going to comment that Bill C-27, bringing it to the Canadian context, is before the House of Commons right now and has proposed major renovations, changes to the federal PIPEDA law, which governs personal data protection in Canada federally. And this is sort of an omnibus bill that's doing a lot of things that I think that neurotechnology sector should monitor. It's not just the change in the rules around protection of personal information, but there's a whole component called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And a lot of these devices that we're talking about integrate artificial intelligence components for the processing and interpretation of the brain data. And I think it's an open question whether neurotechnology actually fits the definition of what's currently an AI system under that act. That act will put a range of quite onerous obligations on those who operate high-impact systems. Again, we don't know what are high-impact systems. That's left to be determined in the regulations. And we also don't know if certain parts of neurotechnology will ultimately be exempted from that act because they're being adequately covered, for example, under Health Canada's medical device regulation sector. So we're in the moment of great fluidity. And I think this is another reason why it would be a good idea to get stakeholders in the area together to start thinking about what of any of this legislation that train is kind of has left the station. It would be a good idea to actually start thinking about what, if any of this, should be captured under this kind of legislation, and to signal the impact, pro and con of that.
Yeah. I'm going to just jump in here. And Mr. Burkhart, sometimes us academics, we wring our hands over things that we think are important, and we get all bent out of shape about worrying things. And I'd like to know if BC Pioneers Coalition is concerned about the collection of EEG data from people who participate in clinical trials, or even in the open society, and if you think about that, and if this is a concern for people like yourself, and should we indeed be wringing our hands as we are on this question?
It certainly is a concern, but I think it's like any other balance that we have right now as far as using any type of technology as to what we're trading off for that privacy for the use case. So, I mean, even just using a lot of web services, you're giving up a lot of personal data. What type of neural data are you giving up that it is really personal? If it is something where you're using it as a communication device, that I think is very personal, and that data should be protected and should be, closely monitored. If you're looking at, for, in my case, the data that's controlling me thinking about opening and closing my hand, well, I don't really care if someone knows if I'm thinking about opening and closing my hand in general, but if I'm using it in certain activities, and they're able to kind of combine that with a lot of other data around my daily life, then it can be something that's a little bit more sensitive and personable. So I think there is that balance. It's certainly something that we do need to be discussing, but I think it's also on a personal level as far as how much privacy an individual is willing to relinquish for the potential capabilities. But that also then can lead into, like Professor Chandler mentioned a little bit of, if you're having all these benefits being promised to someone, they might feel like they should or have to give up a lot more privacy than is really necessary for them to benefit from the technology.
Great, thank you. Mr. Atkinson, over to you.
Okay, question. Shall we move on to the second question? Is my question.
By all means.
Okay. Let me pull that up. So we have a question from Samantha Go. How do we regulate organizations who decide to take on an AI-powered neurotechnology from nonprofit to for-profit? How do we balance the principles of promotion of innovation in neurotechnology, sub-principle A1, safety, principle 7, and intended use and possible misuse?
That's a great question.
How?
I'll take a crack at it if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
I think these are really, really important questions about use and intended use and probable misuse. I think for-profit and non-profit is, to a certain extent here, a false dichotomy. We have in situations of, say, for example, data breaches or data misuse, or even behavioral data misuse, we've seen as much in the public and nonprofit sector as we have in the private for-profit sector. So I think the regulations have to be blanket. They have to cover organizations that, whatever regulations we do develop, should focus on the rights of the individual, and not just the rights to privacy of the individual, but the right to access for technology to the individual, which often, is best delivered by the for-profit or private sector. So the distinction really is, in where we decide to draw the lines for between individual rights and collective rights and these laws and regulations, more so than between whether or not the organizations are public or private or for profit or nonprofit.
I would certainly agree with Graham there, because from a user perspective, it really doesn't matter who has that data, because in the grand scheme of things, companies change, companies go in and out of business. That data can change hands quite often. But it is those regulations or the requirements around the use of that data that I think matters most to the users that are benefiting from this type of technology. And, it needs to be kind of that blanket overall for any industry of how these data can be used and what they can and cannot be used for.
And I would add that I think there's like an implicit opposition proposed in the question between promoting innovation and ensuring safety and dealing with intended use or probable misuse. Listening to people in DBS, there's concern to make sure that the innovation does pay attention to safety and potential harm in order to protect the sector. I don't think that the innovators want to see something go wrong, which would cause a backlash that might imperil the sector. So I would say that certainly there's going to be a balance, I think, between very detailed, onerous regulation that raises expense and causes trouble at the innovation stage. But I think that it's not necessarily a sharp opposition between those values. And the other thing I would say is that I think that those various objectives are not all going to be promoted with one strategy aimed at one stakeholder. I think that there's going to need to be a lot of different things done at different levels to achieve this blend of objectives, because it's not likely that one stakeholder is going to be best placed to achieve one of these objectives on their own. So we have to include everybody in the ecosystem and figure out which tool, which approach is best tailored to which participants.
Mr. Raskin,
Just one.
let's.
Sorry, one more point I wanted to add that there are some very, very significant risks. As we all know, not all startups make it. And not all labs stay open forever. So especially when it comes to implanted neurotechnologies, there is a real risk, especially to, for example, BCI pioneers, that if a company is no longer around to support the technology, that can create real problems for users who have, taken the risk and being innovators in the space. And we really do have to think very carefully about how organizations and regulations will support those people. If the startup goes out of business, who's going to maintain the technology stack for the users in the end?
Yeah, that's right. And there was a sort of recent publications about Second Sight retinal implant published, I think this winter. Was it? No, it was reported last year, but that was the essential problem. You had people with these devices installed who couldn't get information about it, couldn't figure out how to maintain them. There was no support ongoing. And so that's something to figure out for sure.
Yeah. Mr. Atkinson, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this topic. And why don't you weigh in? And then I know you also have a question for the panel. So I'll give you the floor now.
Yes. So, yeah, in terms of, because the question is, how do we regulate organizations who decide to take on, AI powered neurotechnology? The question of regulation, Professor Chandler, that's something that's well in your field as well. Certainly Health Canada plays a role, simply on the safety side, but we can't lose sight of the ISED, that's the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada department. So they also have, legislation, regulation relating to technology governance. So, for example, where there's discussions about where AI is going, they actually have authorities to turn towards that and, work with the international community, in fact, work with the OECD community to develop, what is the best practice governance model, and then bring that back home to Canada. So I say collectively moving forward, we're going to have to consider the role of ISED, along with the role of Health Canada, and along with the role of soft law approaches to providing governance. But I will stop there. So, Dr. Rose, I think one question we want to ask, and this is bringing it back to the moderators, because now that we've kind of laid the landscape of these possible tools, we do want to get a sense from our panelists. How do panelists, how do they see the recommendation being implemented in Canada? And given these options, and Jennifer, we're actually going to turn, Professor Chandler, we're going to turn to you first.
Jennifer, Jen, any of those
Yes.
are fine. So I guess maybe what I can do is perhaps frame the question a little bit with a bit of a discussion of the quote regulatory toolkit and the pros and cons of this. And I would say when I say regulatory toolkit, I'm including a whole range of things that are probably not recognizable as regulation, which we think of as government top-down rules. So I think there's a huge range of approaches to try to help channel the field without necessarily distorting it. There's pros and cons of each of them, but we can look at market pressure or public relations themselves as a kind of regulatory force that affects the development of the field. The next step up, we can look at private ordering, as it's called in amongst lawyers. This is adoption of rules or norms within an industry or group. It can be done at a level of creating the rules or norms, adjudicating disputes, enforcement. An example might be commercial arbitration, where different groups, commercial groups, get together and say, we don't want to deal with the courts, we want our own rules and processes over here. The mafia is a very good example. I think maybe we don't want to go to mafia private ordering, but it's not well tailored to our question here, but it's another excellent example of how groups exclude sort of government activities at the level of lawmaking, adjudication, and enforcement for their own purposes. We can get into what's called soft law. Soft law is quasi-legal instruments like recommendations or guidelines that don't have explicit binding force. Normally, we talk about soft law at the international level, but it exists equally at domestic state level in the form of recommendations, guidelines, statements of good conduct. Codes of conduct can come from industry organizations, professional associations, and so forth. And we are seeing these kinds of things start to percolate in this area. They're not binding in the way that legislation or common law rules are binding, but and they don't have to be necessarily complied with, and maybe aren't, depending upon the risks of non-compliance. But note that these kinds of instruments like guidelines, authority statements, depending on where they come from, what is the level of authority or legitimacy of the group issuing those statements, can often find their way into law. In essence, when courts are trying to decide what's reasonable, they'll look to what the consensus is in the industry. And so it becomes law by the back door in individual disputes over time. And then we get to hard law, which, and as I said earlier, we already enter a space with a whole bunch of hard law legislation, including bits that are in evolution. And there's advantages to the hard law. It's uniform, it's predictable, it's certain. On the other hand, it can distort and constrain innovation. It can be inflexible. And so there's this constant trade-off. Do we want certainty and predictability? Do we want flexibility? Abstract rules are more flexible, but less certain and predictable. Detailed rules are more certain and predictable, but less flexible. And I think I'd close in just pointing to sort of a familiar concept in the area of technological regulation is the so-called Collingridge dilemma. It's a double bind problem applicable to the effort to influence or control technology development. And essentially it says that at the outset, when it's easy to try to influence the development of technology, you can't really foresee what the problems are going to be clearly. Later, when you know what the problems are, it's way harder to change. And after there's been significant investment and development in a particular direction. And so taking into consideration this problem, one doesn't want to create a constraining regulatory regime that distorts and impedes innovation. That would be bad. But we have to always figure out how we're going to retain the ability to try to address problems going forward. And coming back to where I started, it need not necessarily be hard law, actual legislation. It can be a whole range of things short of that, involving some form of self-governance, private ordering, and also recognizing the standard pressures in the market and as well as in influencing the development. So I think one last comment. Again, I think that we're going to have all kinds of elements from this sort of spectrum at play in this space.
Thank you. And I think we should pass over to Dr. Moffat. And again, sort of thinking of those 6 tools or opportunities that were presented, because just reflecting on what Professor Chandler said, there's opportunities for hard law, there's opportunities for soft law, But there's other opportunities as well, such as, as what we see with Queens, like education or possible standards organizations. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on where we should go with implementation.
So, I mean, I don't think there's one clear path here. We really have to set goals as a country and through consultation and try to achieve. If we're going to try to achieve an outcome, we have to decide what we want that outcome to be. In the case of there are a couple of questions that talk about innovation and how we're going to get more innovation in Canada. Typically, you tend to typically think of innovators as liking that kind of soft law approach, where the regulation is not so hard and etched in stone. That can also be a downside as well. For example, especially when it comes to regulating medical devices, or devices that span the boundary between medical and non-medical. Having no regulatory certainty can cause investors to balk at backing a company that doesn't have regulatory certainty in Canada. And it's much more difficult to get regulatory certainty as to whether you fall into or outside of a regulated medical device category. Whereas if you're a company working in the United States, the FDA has a very clear number of categories and a very clear set of guidelines that you can pick a path. And the paths are very rigorous, but they also offer a certain degree of certainty that allows you to plan strategically for the long term and raise capital that you'll need to push through various different obstacles to the development and deployment of the technology. So I think there's a delicate balance to be had. And Canada is very much, at least in the medical device side, on the soft law end of the spectrum relative to comparator countries like or organizations like the EU and the United States. You can do a lot more innovation without crossing boundaries with Health Canada's devices regulatory arm in Canada, but you also can't get certainty from them as easily without going through a formal process. So it's a delicate challenge, and I think there's room for more regulation, for more hard law that would actually help innovation in Canada, and that would bring technologies to market more quickly.
Mm-hmm. And if I could say, moving beyond opportunities for hard law, because there are 9 principles, and not all principles are kind of going to fit into that hard law component. Concepts like ensuring equity rather. These are things we need to think about it, and how do we move forward in terms of pushing this out into our society and making this more available to all the stakeholders across the neurotechnology spectrum. And perhaps Mr. Burkhart, we could get you feel free to chime in on that too if you want.
Yeah, I certainly think, it's like the rest of the panel has discussed, there is that balance of what can you do to make sure that innovation is happening properly, but also you're not going to stifle innovation by having too much hard law that's really going to hinder raising capital, raising funds, or the further scope of what someone can think of these technologies being used for, if they have to fit into these kind of set categories. Graham mentioned, in the States, we do have the FDA has a great process of how things are set up that does allow for a lot of innovation to come through and a lot of companies to get funding, which is fantastic, but it is a rather lengthy process. A lot of the, even the BCI technology, especially on the implanted side, it's gaining more steam now, but it's still pushing along at a really slow pace to get through the FDA approval. And then when you look at external devices, it's still, how can those devices be used in a proper manner that you're gaining good data from them, but they're also, safe and effective for the overall outset of the problem. On the consumer side, there's a lot of devices that have been marketed for gaming or kind of this wellness category. And those are something that, I think really needs to fall more on the soft law side of how the back end data is being handled, because the overall risk of using the device is pretty minimal. It's not going to, harm you, but you could then be harmed with how this data could be used against you. And I think that was kind of shown light when Jennifer talked about the 2 legal cases that have been already shown how this data can be used both to kind of both for and against someone in a criminal setting. That really is something that was not anticipated at all when these devices were being developed.
Thank you. So I'm going to launch another question. I'm going to add a few layers to it. So one thing that we're extremely interested in as a panel on behalf of Health Canada and in our obligation to fulfill the OECD requirement is to think about who are the stakeholders who should be at the table in continuing on this journey to respond to the OECD recommendations. Who needs to be at the table? Who is our audience at the end of the day? And then I just want to layer on, and borrowing a little bit from the questions in the chat, are there the lessons that we can learn, that this group that we're going to assemble can learn from the cybersecurity arena? And also bearing in mind that some people believe that the horse has already left the barn, that we can already read minds, we already can control minds. How do we move forward when in fact there are considerations when there are issues to already take into consideration, given the state of the art on a global level? So who are the stakeholders who need to be at the table? Who's the audience? What lessons can we learn from other sectors? And how do we move forward in the face of work that's already been done and considerations that we need to embody? So who would like to tackle my four-layer question first? Mr. Atkinson, I'm going to ask you.
Okay, very good question. Who needs to be at the table? I know, I think one important concept about who needs to be at the table is who wants to be at the table. So, following up from this panel, I think our hope is to now reach out and socialize this, not just as part of this event, but in additional outreach, is who has the fire in their belly? Who thinks they need to be there? Is it the patient groups? Is it the researchers? Is it the entrepreneurs? Those with an interest in sort of a legal bent. So that's part of how we move forward. We need to really identify who has the fire in the belly for that. We also have to include the regulators, and there are different regulators, as I've indicated. We have the industry side regulators who can play a very important role in some aspects of this, and Health Canada as well. But keep in mind that there are 9 principles, and although safety and data privacy, those are ripe for inclusion into hard law and are probably already there. There are other principles that are not really, that really don't have a home and would require soft law. So that's why we think we need to have bring in the right players. And my best guess is, patient communities, providers, entrepreneurs, legal experts, anyone who has that interest in participating. Start with the core, the coalition of the willing, as a previous president once said.
Thank you. Others, please weigh in. Professor Chandler, you're leaning forward.
Yeah, I think another dimension of this, like Graham really helpfully took us through the place of Canada within the global sort of ecosystem. And it may well be, I mean, we're all for a strong and leading domestic industry. There will be activity going on elsewhere. And so part of this debate will be to assemble the group in Canada that can really understand what are the Canadian realities, the Canada-specific questions, and also to interact with similar efforts going on in these other jurisdictions, because devices developed and initially marketed in other places, we may want to have come to Canada. And so the opportunity to influence the discussion and the development of these devices will require having some sort of influence also outside Canada. We are sort of a small player, despite being a big country. And so I think it'd be important to also keep that in our sights, as well as how to feed into a bigger discussion in order to influence development and marketing of devices in Canada too.
Thank you. Mr. Brookhart, path
Yeah,
forward?
I'd like to take on your question about the horse already leaving the barn, because I think that is really challenging. And, you know, some people want to just say, well, okay, we throw up our hands, we can't do anything about it now because it's too late. But that's really I think a pessimistic way of looking at it. But also we need to realize, you know, what is the actual state of the art and what's being done versus what's the science fiction about what could be done and what's going on. Right now, you know, these devices aren't able to really read someone's mind. They're not controlling someone to a direct, distinctive point. You know, they are enabling them to, you know, in the case of DBS, they're enabling them to help reduce tremors, most popularly. And then in other BCI type environments, they're allowing people to take information out of the brain. There is some where they're able to stimulate back into the brain to provide sensation. But it's not, you know, like a flip of the light switch where you're, you know, completely changing someone's life and putting them all the way back to where they were prior to disability. So I think it is something where, you know, we need to make sure that we're still having these conversations and we're not giving up, because these technologies, while they're really exciting and promising, they're not to the point where it's, you know, putting a microchip in someone's brain and completely controlling them. We're not there yet. So I think it's really something that we do need to have these discussions to make sure that all the, you know, stakeholders are involved and we can get all of their priorities and experiences involved in making any type of regulations.
Thank you. Dr. Moffat, a brief last comment on path forward or your last thoughts?
I actually have a question for Andrew, which is, if someone wanted to put up their hand and you know, was motivated to participate, how would they get involved? And this question is sort of on behalf of our attendees,
Yes.
some of whom I know are interested.
Great. So we do have an answer for that. In fact, I will turn to Natalie, who has a slide.
Perfect.
And she can post.
Thanks for queuing that up. That was very nice, very nice. It wasn't even a plant.
Yeah, it was not a plant. So, so we do want to move forward now. I think people are well aware that Health Canada has an involvement of that, but I did mention that, you know, as us being at the table, we're really representing the federal government, which is kind of the way participation in the OECD working groups function. So it's even though I'm Health Canada employee, I have a seat at the table. I am representing Government of Canada, and I'm also representing the broader interest of the nation. So certainly at this time, we're in a position to welcome individuals, people who are interested can send us an email, and we can put you on the list. What we can do for now, for the time being, is we can, moving forward, begin some of an ad hoc task group that will look at approaches to implementation. Whether or not that's something that would stay with Health Canada or something that would ultimately be delegated out to another organization, that's up for question. But if I can say, we're the government. That's our superpower. We know how to convene meetings. Okay, that's what we do. We're very good at convening meetings. So we'll exercise our superpower in terms of bringing people together, and then help develop that plan forward, and look at the mix of people who are interested in this. Look at all these tools and opportunities that we have within Canada that could actually help foster that. And case in point is the work being done by Queen's University. I think we're collectively fortunate that they've taken on that activity and started with the development of tools, because as they say, build it and they will come. And I do think we're hitting right on 1:30 now. I think that seems like a reasonable path forward. Is let us develop that coalition of the willing, and we will convene and begin to map out a plan into the future. Yeah. Ultimately, OECD is going to come back to the member states, and they're going to ask each person, each member, what have you done? And I think we're in pretty good shape right now, because that's still a number of years down the road. I know other jurisdictions are making headway, like France. Other jurisdictions are going to be in a bit more difficulty. Ian, the United States is a very big ship to move, and I don't envy trying to set up an implementation plan for a country that size. But fortunately, I think Canada's the right size to implement, and I think I'm confident we'll find the right fit for us.
Nice. Thank you. So Trudy, I know you have 2 feedback questions. Thank you for putting those up and anticipating my request. We're a minute after the end, so I just want to thank all of you who joined us today. And I want to thank our panelists deeply for joining us and providing their expertise and insights, and for Health Canada for hosting this event, and CSPC for welcoming us. I'm going to give the last word over to Mr. Atkinson, and again, express my deepest thanks to everyone.
And yes, and thank you all. Thank you for not only being part of the panel, but thank many of you for actually participating in the neurotechnology initiatives. And certainly a lot of, you stand as opinion leaders within Canada and within the US, and you made substantive contributions, and you helped bring us to where we're at. So I'm very grateful for that, and very much looking forward to working with you in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.